Live television doesn't come with a warning label, and this moment proved exactly why. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. Because sometimes the most talked about moments on daytime television aren't the loudest ones, they're the ones that slowly build, piece by piece, right in front of a live audience that isn't quite sure what they're watching unfold. On this particular morning, the atmosphere on The View felt like many others before it. The studio lights were bright, the audience energy was steady, and the panel was in rhythm. Joy Behar, as usual, sat poised with her signature dry humor ready. The co-hosts had just wrapped up a topical discussion in the Hot Topic segment, and the tone had been relatively balanced, a mix of light political commentary and cultural chatter. Nothing unusual. Nothing tense. Then Dwayne Johnson walked out. The audience reaction was immediate and warm. Applause filled the studio in that familiar way reserved for high-profile guests. Johnson, known for his composed public presence and charismatic demeanor, greeted the panel with a handshake and quick side hugs. He smiled broadly, waved to the crowd, and settled into his chair. Everything about his body language at that moment signaled comfort. Shoulders relaxed, posture open. That calm, confident presence he's known for. The segment began as expected. The hosts congratulated him on his latest project, and the conversation started in safe territory: film promotion, production challenges, fitness discipline, and his ability to balance multiple business ventures. Johnson answered thoughtfully, speaking at an even pace. He thanked the hosts, credited his team, and shared a brief anecdote about long days on set. The audience laughed at the right moments. Joy nodded along, occasionally interjecting with her trademark quick quips. For the first several minutes, nothing hinted at what would follow. But as often happens on live daytime television, the conversation began to drift from promotion into broader topics. One of the co-hosts referenced Johnson's public comments from previous interviews about leadership, personal responsibility, and civic engagement. The shift was subtle. The tone changed from entertainment to public discourse, which isn't unusual for The View. It's part of the show's identity. Joy Behar leaned slightly forward in her chair at this point. She framed her question carefully, but directly. She mentioned Johnson's past statements about unity and about possibly considering public service in the future. The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't confrontational, but it was pointed. She asked whether he felt celebrities sometimes oversimplify complex political realities when speaking about bringing people together. You could see the first visible change in Johnson's posture. He stopped smiling quite as broadly. His hands, which had been resting casually on his knees, clasped together. His answer started measured. He acknowledged that public conversations are complex. He said he tries to speak from personal experience rather than policy expertise. He emphasized that unity is a value he believes in deeply. His voice remained calm, but it became more deliberate. Joy listened, but she followed up. And this is where the shift became noticeable. She referenced a specific instance where Johnson had publicly criticized political division while declining to endorse any particular position. She asked whether staying neutral while encouraging unity could be seen as avoiding accountability. The audience murmured slightly, not loudly, just enough to signal interest. Johnson's facial expression changed again. His jaw tightened slightly. He maintained eye contact with Joy, but there was a pause before he responded. A longer pause than earlier in the segment. He clarified that he doesn't view himself as neutral but rather as cautious. He said that in today's environment, anything said publicly can quickly be misinterpreted. He stressed that he prefers to engage in community-level conversations rather than partisan debate. His tone was steady, but there was an edge of firmness that hadn't been there before. Joy pressed again, though still within the boundaries of talk show decorum. She asked whether caution from influential voices sometimes contributes to the very divisions they say they want to reduce. It wasn't a raised voice moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply direct. This is where the temperature in the room subtly changed. Johnson leaned back slightly in his chair. He exhaled audibly before speaking. He said he disagreed with the premise that silence equals complicity. He explained that leadership can take different forms. His voice grew more emphatic, not shouting, but unmistakably more forceful. He gestured with his hands for the first time in the segment, palms open, emphasizing his words. The other hosts began to step in gently. One tried to reframe the discussion, saying that many viewers struggle with where celebrities fit into civic conversations. Another nodded toward Johnson and said she understood the pressure public figures face. But Joy wasn't finished. She said she respected his accomplishments and acknowledged his influence, but she reiterated that with influence comes responsibility. She added that audiences look to figures like him for clarity in uncertain times. Her tone wasn't combative. It was steady, almost analytical. Johnson's response came quicker this time. He said responsibility doesn't always mean public declarations. He said he works privately with organizations, mentors young people, and invests in communities. He asked whether that form of engagement is less valuable because it isn't broadcast in headlines. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and silence. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was noticeable. What made this moment feel different wasn't volume. It was intensity. The measured pacing of the conversation had shifted. The smiles were fewer. The interruptions slightly more frequent. Joy began speaking over Johnson at one point, not in a shouting match, but in that overlapping way that live television sometimes creates. He stopped mid-sentence, then restarted. That small disruption was the first true sign of friction. His composure remained, but there was visible frustration in the way he leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped tighter now. He said he felt the question implied a lack of courage, and he gently pushed back against that implication. Joy clarified that she wasn't questioning his courage, but rather the broader role of celebrity voices in political discourse. The exchange remained civil, but the tension was undeniable. As viewers at home, this was the moment you realized the segment had moved beyond routine promotion. The studio felt quieter. The co-hosts were more alert. The audience energy had shifted from light enthusiasm to focused attention. And it was clear that what started as a typical daytime interview had turned into something more layered, a live exchange where two strong personalities were navigating a sensitive topic in real time. The disagreement hadn't exploded. There was no shouting. No dramatic walk-offs. But the emotional temperature had risen enough that everyone in the room, and watching at home, could feel it building. And the segment wasn't over yet. As the conversation continued, what stood out most wasn't volume, but restraint. The segment had clearly shifted from a promotional interview into something more layered and personal, and both Dwayne Johnson and Joy Behar seemed aware that they were navigating delicate ground. The live audience had quieted noticeably. The light laughter that had punctuated the first half of the segment was gone. In its place was the kind of attentive silence that signals people are leaning in. Johnson adjusted slightly in his chair, shoulders squared, hands still clasped loosely in front of him. He maintained eye contact with Joy as he continued his response. His tone remained measured, but there was a firmness now that hadn't been there at the start. He explained that he understands the expectations placed on public figures, particularly those with large platforms. He acknowledged that people often want clarity and directness. But he also emphasized that leadership, in his view, isn't always about public declarations. Joy nodded as he spoke, but she was preparing her next question. When he finished, she interjected calmly. She said she appreciated his explanation but asked whether avoiding specifics might leave audiences confused about where he truly stands. She framed it as a question about transparency rather than accusation. Still, the phrasing landed heavily. Johnson paused before answering. This time, the pause felt intentional. He looked briefly toward the other co-hosts, then back at Joy. He said transparency is important to him, but so is nuance. He explained that issues are rarely simple, and reducing them to quick endorsements or sound bites can do more harm than good. His voice grew slightly more animated, though still controlled. He leaned forward again, palms open, emphasizing that complexity deserves thoughtful discussion, not quick headlines. At this point, one of the other co-hosts attempted to ease the tension by broadening the topic. She mentioned how many celebrities struggle with balancing personal beliefs and public expectations. She shared that even within the panel, they sometimes disagree on how outspoken to be. The tone softened briefly as she spoke, and Johnson nodded in agreement. But Joy brought the conversation back to Johnson specifically. She clarified that the reason she was pressing the issue was because of his unique influence. She pointed out that his audience spans political lines, age groups, and communities. When someone with that kind of reach speaks about unity, she said, people listen. Her voice remained even, but her gaze was steady. The studio audience responded with light applause at that comment. It wasn't directed against Johnson, but it signaled agreement with the point being made. Johnson acknowledged the applause with a small nod, but his expression had shifted. The easy smile from earlier was gone entirely now. In its place was a focused seriousness. He responded by saying that unity, for him, begins with listening. He said he believes in having conversations with people who disagree. He mentioned that public discourse often rewards extreme positions and punishes middle ground. His tone sharpened slightly when he said that. It wasn't anger exactly, it was frustration, but the controlled kind. He gestured subtly toward the audience and said that many Americans don't feel represented by loud, polarized debates. Joy leaned back briefly, then leaned forward again. She asked whether calling out polarization without naming specific actions or policies might unintentionally protect the status quo. That question shifted the energy once more. You could feel it in the room. A few audience members murmured again. One or two clapped hesitantly, unsure whether to fully commit. Johnson's response came faster this time. He said he disagreed with the idea that he was protecting anything. He explained that he chooses to engage privately with leaders across various sectors. He emphasized that his efforts focus on mentorship programs, educational initiatives, and community investment. He said those actions may not make headlines, but they are meaningful to him. Joy interrupted gently, asking whether private action without public accountability can inspire widespread change. It was the first moment where their voices overlapped clearly. Johnson stopped mid-sentence, then waited for her to finish. There was a brief, awkward beat, the kind of silence that feels longer than it is on live television. One of the co-hosts placed a hand lightly on the table and said, "Let's make sure we're hearing each other." Her tone was calm, serving as a subtle moderator. The audience laughed softly at that, easing the tension just a fraction. Johnson took a breath before continuing. He said he didn't feel unheard, but he did feel that his motives were being questioned. His voice lowered slightly, which made the moment feel more intimate rather than explosive. He explained that he grew up in circumstances that shaped his perspective on responsibility and service. He said his focus has always been on impact rather than optics. Joy responded that questioning public roles is part of what The View does. She smiled briefly to soften the statement, but the seriousness remained. She clarified that challenging guests isn't personal, it's part of the conversation viewers expect. That comment seemed to recalibrate the exchange slightly. Johnson nodded and said he respected that. He even smiled faintly, acknowledging the format of the show. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted from defensive to analytical. The disagreement became less about personal motives and more about philosophical differences. Still, the emotional undercurrent remained visible. Johnson's posture stayed forward-leaning. His gestures were more pronounced than earlier in the segment. Joy maintained steady eye contact and kept her questions direct, but her tone stayed within daytime decorum. Another co-host chimed in with a broader observation about how public figures often feel boxed into binary choices. She said the public sometimes demands immediate answers to complex issues. Johnson agreed with that point and elaborated, saying that rushing to comment can oversimplify serious matters. Joy countered by saying that silence can also speak loudly. The room went quiet again. What made the moment resonate wasn't hostility. It was authenticity. Both individuals were articulating sincerely held views about public responsibility. The disagreement wasn't theatrical. It felt like something viewers might discuss at their own kitchen tables: the role of influence, the balance between privacy and leadership, the expectation placed on people with platforms. At one point, Johnson adjusted his jacket and shifted back in his seat, as if consciously grounding himself. His voice steadied again, losing some of the earlier edge. He acknowledged that perhaps he could communicate more clearly about his values without aligning himself publicly with specific factions. That small concession shifted the energy in the room. Joy acknowledged that clarification with a nod. She said she appreciated hearing that directly. Her tone softened slightly. The audience responded with modest applause, signaling relief more than celebration. But the conversation wasn't entirely resolved. Johnson added that he hoped viewers understood that thoughtful engagement doesn't always look like loud declarations. Joy replied that thoughtful engagement also includes tough questions. That exchange, brief as it was, encapsulated the tension of the segment. By this point, several minutes had passed since the initial shift in tone. The audience had experienced a gradual escalation, not in decibels, but in intensity. The other co-hosts were clearly monitoring the pacing, stepping in when necessary, allowing space when appropriate. The producers, though unseen, likely signaled that time was running short. You could sense it in the way the panel began tightening their remarks. But before the segment could wrap cleanly, one final exchange pushed the tension slightly higher. Joy asked whether Johnson would ever consider taking a clear public stance if he believed silence was contributing to harm. It was a hypothetical, but a pointed one. Johnson leaned forward again. This time, his answer was immediate and firm. He said if he believed silence was causing harm, he would speak. He emphasized that he does not shy away from difficult conversations. His voice carried more weight in that moment, not louder, but more grounded. The audience applauded more confidently this time. The segment was approaching its final stretch, but the emotional residue of the exchange lingered. It was clear that what had started as a routine appearance had evolved into something more substantive, a live example of how difficult conversations unfold in real time on daytime television. And as the show moved toward its closing moments, the question wasn't whether there had been tension. That was obvious. The question was how both sides would choose to leave the conversation, escalated further, or recalibrated before the cameras cut away. By the time the segment moved into what was clearly its final stretch, the energy in the studio had shifted from tension to something more reflective. The disagreement hadn't erupted into shouting or spectacle, but it had reached a point where both Dwayne Johnson and Joy Behar had firmly staked out their perspectives. What made the moment compelling wasn't volume. It was the visible effort from both sides to remain composed while clearly disagreeing. Johnson's posture, which had been forward and engaged, gradually settled back into the chair again. His hands unclasped, resting on the table this time instead of gripping his knees. That subtle physical change signaled a cooling down, not surrender, but recalibration. He had made his point clearly. He had pushed back where he felt it was necessary. Now he seemed intent on finishing the conversation with clarity rather than confrontation. Joy, for her part, also shifted slightly. She adjusted her notes on the table, glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at Johnson. Her expression softened just enough to signal that the exchange had reached its peak. She acknowledged that these kinds of discussions are exactly why the show invites guests with broad public influence. She said viewers appreciate hearing unscripted perspectives, even when they don't align perfectly. One of the co-hosts jumped in with what felt like an intentional attempt to broaden the lens again. She noted that public discourse has become increasingly polarized, and perhaps what viewers were witnessing in that moment was a healthy example of disagreement handled respectfully. The audience responded with light applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was affirming. Johnson nodded at that framing. He said he welcomed dialogue, even difficult dialogue. His voice had returned to a calmer cadence, slower, more measured than it had been at the height of the exchange. He reiterated that his intention has never been to avoid responsibility, but to engage thoughtfully. He emphasized that he listens before speaking, especially when the stakes feel high. Joy responded with a small smile and said that listening is valuable, but so is clarity. Her tone was no longer pressing. It was summarizing. She restated that her line of questioning wasn't about doubting his character, but about exploring the broader role public figures play in shaping civic conversations. At this point, the live audience seemed more at ease. A few people nodded visibly. The mood had shifted from tension to something closer to thoughtful engagement. What stood out was how quickly the atmosphere in a studio can change based on tone alone. A few minutes earlier, overlapping voices and tightened expressions had dominated. Now the exchange felt more structured again. But there was still one moment that added another layer. Johnson brought up something that hadn't been mentioned before. He said that sometimes, when public figures speak too definitively on complex matters, they risk alienating the very people they hope to bring together. He spoke about the importance of maintaining open channels across differences. His hands moved deliberately as he explained, palms facing upward as if weighing options. Joy leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand as she listened. When he finished, she asked whether there's a difference between alienating people and challenging them. It was a quieter question, but it carried weight. Johnson paused again, though this pause felt less defensive and more reflective. He acknowledged that challenge is necessary for growth. He agreed that uncomfortable conversations can be productive. But he added that he believes those conversations are most effective when grounded in relationship rather than declaration. The audience reacted with a few murmurs of agreement. It was the kind of reaction that suggests people were processing, not reacting emotionally. Another co-host pointed out that this exchange itself demonstrated that balance. She noted that no one had raised their voice, yet strong points had been made. That observation drew a brief laugh from the audience, likely recognizing how rare that balance can feel in televised discussions. For a moment, it appeared the segment might close there, on a note of mutual acknowledgement. But Joy had one final observation. She said that part of her job is to represent viewers who feel frustrated when influential voices seem cautious during turbulent times. She emphasized that asking hard questions doesn't mean assuming bad faith. Johnson nodded slowly. His expression was serious but no longer tight. He said he understood that perspective. He admitted that public scrutiny can feel personal, even when it isn't intended that way. That admission was subtle but important. It softened the tone further. He added that perhaps moments like this, where perspectives differ but remain civil, are part of the unity he talks about. The audience responded with stronger applause this time. It wasn't about choosing sides. It felt more like appreciation for the resolution of tension without escalation. Joy smiled more openly now. She said she could agree with that. The exchange ended not with a definitive resolution, but with a shared understanding that disagreement itself isn't the problem. Avoidance of conversation is. As the host nearest the center of the table signaled that time was wrapping up, the producers likely counting down in their earpieces, the energy shifted once more into typical daytime pacing. Johnson thanked the panel for the discussion. He emphasized that he respects platforms that allow space for nuance. Joy thanked him for engaging rather than deflecting. There was a brief moment where Johnson and Joy made direct eye contact and shared a small, knowing smile. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't overly sentimental. It simply suggested that both recognized the intensity of the exchange and the importance of handling it professionally. The audience applauded as the conversation transitioned back to Johnson's film project. A short promotional clip played on the studio monitors. When the clip ended, the applause resumed, now lighter and more typical of an entertainment segment. What lingered, though, was the emotional arc viewers had just witnessed. In real time, a routine interview had turned into a thoughtful, occasionally tense discussion about influence and responsibility. No one stormed off. No one raised their voice dramatically. But the visible tightening of posture, the overlapping interruptions, the shift in vocal cadence, all of it told the story of a moment that felt unscripted and genuine. As the show cut to commercial, the audience buzzed softly. People leaned toward one another, whispering quick reactions. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked contemplative. It was clear that the segment had left an impression. On live television, those are often the moments that resonate most, not because they explode, but because they unfold gradually, revealing how public figures handle disagreement when there's nowhere to hide and no opportunity to edit. And though the cameras had shifted back to routine programming, the impact of that exchange was only beginning to ripple outward beyond the studio walls. When the show returned from commercial, The atmosphere felt steadier, but noticeably more deliberate. The promotional clip for Dwayne Johnson's project had done its job in resetting the tone, yet the earlier exchange lingered in the room. The audience applause as the camera lights came back up was warm, though not quite as exuberant as it had been when he first walked out. It wasn't negative, it was reflective. People had just witnessed something more substantial than a routine celebrity appearance. Johnson smiled again, though it was a more composed smile than the effortless one from the beginning of the segment. His posture was upright, shoulders squared but relaxed. Joy also appeared settled, her expression neutral but attentive. The shift was subtle. Both seemed aware that the earlier discussion had carried weight, and neither appeared interested in reigniting tension. The host nearest the center pivoted the conversation back toward lighter ground. She referenced Johnson's upcoming schedule and asked about the physical preparation for his latest role. The question was clearly designed to reestablish familiar territory. Johnson responded smoothly, describing training routines and the discipline required to maintain consistency. The audience responded with light laughter when he joked about early morning workouts. For a few minutes, the exchange felt almost like a typical daytime talk show rhythm again. The other co-host chimed in about balancing work and family. Johnson shared a brief anecdote about parenting and time management. The laughter returned, though softer than earlier. It felt as though everyone, panel, guest, and audience, was collectively regaining balance. But what stood out during this portion wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said. Johnson's tone was steady, but there was an underlying seriousness that hadn't been there at the start of the show. Even in lighter moments, he seemed more measured. His gestures were smaller. He paused more frequently before answering, as though choosing words carefully. Joy remained engaged, but less pointed. When she asked follow-up questions, they were brief and centered around the project itself. At one point, she made a quick, humorous comment about action films requiring less dialogue and more explosions. The audience laughed, and Johnson responded with an easy grin. It was a visible reset. Yet there was a moment, small but telling, when the conversation circled back, indirectly, to the earlier topic. Another co-host referenced how Johnson's on-screen characters often embody leadership. She asked whether portraying leaders influences how he views leadership off-screen. The question wasn't confrontational, but it carried echoes of the earlier exchange. Johnson acknowledged the connection. He said playing characters who face difficult choices has reinforced his belief that leadership is complex. He emphasized that strong leadership involves listening, accountability, and resilience. His voice was calm, but it held the clarity that had emerged during the earlier disagreement. Joy nodded thoughtfully. She added that audiences sometimes project those heroic qualities onto actors themselves. Her tone this time was observational rather than challenging. Johnson agreed, saying that while he's grateful for admiration, he's mindful that he's not the characters he portrays. The audience reaction here was subdued but attentive. The earlier tensions seemed to have created a different kind of focus in the room. Viewers were listening not just for entertainment, but for meaning. As the segment moved closer to its conclusion, the host gave Johnson an opportunity to address viewers directly. This is a common talk show moment, a closing thought, often promotional. But Johnson used it slightly differently. He thanked the panel for the conversation, not just the opportunity to promote his film, but the opportunity to discuss bigger ideas. He said he values spaces where different perspectives can be shared respectfully. He emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean division. His tone was steady and reflective. The audience applauded, more confidently now. It wasn't explosive applause. It felt appreciative. Joy joined in, nodding as he spoke. Then Joy offered a brief closing comment of her own. She said that the show aims to create space for candid discussion, even when it gets uncomfortable. She added that discomfort isn't always a bad thing if it leads to understanding. Her voice carried no edge now, only resolution. The moment felt like a mutual acknowledgement. Not an agreement on every point, but a recognition of the process. As the show prepared to transition into the next segment, there was a brief exchange of off-script body language that viewers at home could still see. Johnson leaned slightly toward Joy and said something quietly off mic. Joy responded with a small laugh and a nod. The audience didn't hear the words, but the gesture suggested that whatever friction had existed was professional, not personal. The host thanked Johnson again as the audience gave a final round of applause. He stood, waved to the crowd, and shook hands with the panel as he exited. His demeanor remained composed, though perhaps more serious than when he had first entered. As the camera followed him briefly toward the backstage area before cutting to the next topic, the audience's energy shifted once more. There was a noticeable buzz, quiet conversations among attendees who had just witnessed a live exchange that felt unscripted and real. The panel took a few seconds to reset. Papers were adjusted. Water glasses were lifted. One co-host made a light remark about how live television keeps everyone alert. The audience chuckled. The show moved on. But for viewers watching at home, the earlier exchange lingered. The disagreement hadn't been explosive. There were no viral theatrics, no raised voices or walk-offs. Instead, it unfolded in layers, starting with a pointed question, escalating through overlapping dialogue and tightened expressions, and ultimately settling into reflection. What made it resonate was how real it felt. The pacing shifts, the pauses, the subtle changes in posture. These are the details that reveal genuine tension. And they're the kinds of moments that don't always dominate headlines immediately, but often spark deeper conversation afterward. By the time the episode concluded, it was clear that something meaningful had occurred. Not dramatic in the conventional sense, but significant in its authenticity. And as the show signed off for the day, the real conversation was only beginning beyond the studio walls. By the time the show reached its final moments and the credits began to roll, the studio felt noticeably lighter than it had midway through the segment, but there was still a sense that something meaningful had taken place. The audience applauded as the hosts gave their usual closing remarks, and the tone returned to familiar daytime warmth. Yet if you watched closely, you could tell that both Dwayne Johnson and Joy Behar had left an impression that extended beyond routine promotion. Inside the studio, once the cameras pulled back and the applause softened, the audience buzz became more audible. People leaned toward one another, whispering quick reactions. Some nodded in approval, clearly appreciating the directness of the exchange. Others seemed contemplative, replaying specific moments in their minds. The pause before Johnson responded, the overlap in voices when Joy pressed a follow-up, the way both recalibrated before the segment ended. For those who attend live tapings, it's rare to witness a segment shift that organically from light promotion to philosophical disagreement and back again, without producers cutting it short. The fact that the conversation was allowed to unfold, even as it grew tense, stood out to many in the room. Backstage, according to later reports shared in post-show interviews and insider commentary, there was no dramatic fallout. There was no shouting behind the scenes, no abrupt exits. Johnson reportedly thanked the hosts again before leaving, and the atmosphere remained professional. That detail mattered because it reinforced what viewers had already sensed. The tension had been genuine but controlled, rooted in differing viewpoints rather than personal animosity. Once the episode aired nationwide, however, the moment took on a life of its own. Clips of the exchange began circulating online within hours. Short segments highlighting the most pointed parts of the discussion, particularly Joy's question about whether caution from influential voices contributes to division, were shared across social media platforms. Viewers debated whether Johnson had been unfairly pressed or whether Joy had simply done what she is known for doing, asking direct questions. What was notable in the online reaction was how divided it was, but not in an explosive way. Many viewers praised Johnson for remaining calm and articulating his stance clearly. They pointed out that he didn't deflect or shut down the conversation. Instead, he engaged, even when visibly uncomfortable. Others applauded Joy for holding firm. They argued that her role on a show like this is to represent viewers who want accountability from public figures. They noted that her tone remained steady and that she clarified her intentions when Johnson expressed frustration. There were, of course, comments from viewers who felt the exchange was unnecessary during what they expected to be a promotional appearance. But even among critics, the conversation rarely described the moment as chaotic or inappropriate. Instead, it was characterized as tense but professional, the kind of live television exchange that reveals personality and principle. Media commentators weighed in the following day. Some daytime talk analysts noted that the segment demonstrated why The View continues to generate attention decades into its run. It blends entertainment with real-time debate. Others highlighted Johnson's composure, suggesting that moments like this show how he navigates public scrutiny beyond movie premieres and red carpets. On the next episode of the show, the panel briefly referenced the previous day's discussion. Joy addressed it directly in a measured tone. She reiterated that challenging questions are part of the show's format and emphasized that disagreement does not equal disrespect. She mentioned that Johnson had been gracious both on-air and off-air. The acknowledgement was brief, but important, signaling closure. Johnson, for his part, addressed the exchange in a short interview clip shared later that week. He said he appreciated platforms that allow honest dialogue. He admitted that tough questions can feel personal in the moment, but added that he respects thoughtful debate. His response reinforced the impression that, while the exchange had been tense, it was not damaging. In hindsight, what made the moment resonate wasn't a dramatic outburst or raised voices. It was the subtle build, the tightening of posture, the longer pauses, the shift in cadence, the visible effort from both individuals to stand firm without crossing into hostility. That's what viewers responded to. It also served as a reminder of how live television differs from pre-recorded interviews. There are no retakes, no edits to smooth over awkward beats. When tension rises, it does so in real time, and everyone, hosts, guests, audience, must navigate it together. For many viewers, the most powerful part of the segment wasn't the disagreement itself, but the resolution. Johnson acknowledging that clarity matters. Joy acknowledging that engagement is valuable. The mutual recognition that respectful friction can lead to understanding. In the days that followed, think pieces and online discussions continued to reference the exchange as an example of how public discourse can remain civil even when opinions diverge. It became less about who won and more about how both handled the pressure of a live moment. Looking back, the phrase unexpected meltdown might not fully capture what occurred. There was visible frustration. There was firmness. There was a shift in tone that caught viewers' attention. But it was not an explosive unraveling. It was a controlled confrontation of ideas, the kind that reveals character rather than chaos. And that may be why it resonated. In the end, the segment concluded the way strong live television often does, with tension acknowledged, respect maintained, and conversation extended beyond the studio walls. It reminded viewers that disagreement doesn't have to derail dialogue. It can deepen it. As always, moments like this invite interpretation. Some will see Johnson's response as measured strength. Others will see Joy's persistence as necessary accountability. What's undeniable is that the exchange felt real, unscripted, unpolished, and authentically human. And that's what keeps audiences watching. If you watched that episode, what did you think? Was the questioning fair? Did Johnson handle it the right way? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.